thanks for glad we could do it finally. Just miss each other back and forth. That's but glad to be here.
Speaking of here, it's been a minute since you have been on the program. So Ryan, introduce yourself for people.
Yeah, I'm Ryan Newson. I teach theology and ethics at Campbell University. I'm associate professor of theology and ethics there. I also direct what's called the biomedical humanities program. So critiquing the practice of medicine through the lens of various humanities, often, in my case, ethics and theology, but not exclusively. Been here since 2015 and love it.
So you were on the podcast to talk about a previous book that you had written about the lost cause. And now you have a new book called The End of Civility, Christ and Prophetic Division. We are recording this. It took a while for us to do this, but maybe it's appropriate because this is the week of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And you have a quote that gets to the heart of your argument right at the beginning of the book. And so this is from Dr. King, When Peace Becomes Obnoxious. Number 1, if peace means accepting second-class citizenship, I don't want it. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. If peace means being complacently adjusted to a deadening status quo, I don't want peace. If peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated, and segregated, I don't want peace. So in a passive, nonviolent manner, we must revolt against this peace. Not only is he critiquing an account of civility that is in service to the status quo, I can't think of another figure who also embodies civility in service to the status quo as much as the historical figure we know in public discourse is Martin Luther King Jr. That he's appealed to a certain aspect of his career is appealed to in order to maintain decorum and civility and the status quo. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he's sort of that's why I think that's interesting. I think first of all, he's like a lot of figures, like he's a kind of Rorschach test where folks, you get
like Bonhoeffer. Yeah.
100%. Well, as my favorite professor, Dr. Pugh, would always talk about with Bonhoeffer. In some ways, like, anyway. So yeah, I think a lot of figures get this treatment, and especially the figures that people who pushed back on norms of their day. There's a real tendency and desire to incorporate. If you cannot expel, then try to incorporate those aspects of the aspects of those figures and people that don't fit the narrative. You want to like make them part of your own or something like that. And so, yeah, there's a tendency to like focus in on certain specific lines of speeches, content of character, not color of skin, and to turn King into somebody that he really was not. And that in his day, even actions that he did that were peaceable, or someone might point to as like an example of respecting decorum or something like that, were still in this broader service of disrupting a profoundly unjust status quo, to put it mildly, that folks in that day, I just have a hard time thinking, would have liked King, actually, even if they point to him now as this example of how we, quote, should do blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. Because in his day, he was not very popular by the end of his life either. So, yeah, I love that quote for that specific reason. There's a ton of those like that where King, the real King, or Cornel West's book, The Radical King, it's just right there. I just don't think people engage him as seriously as they often should. Certainly not as often as he's evoked and invoked, especially once a year around this time. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, it's it's the same with Jesus and Paul. Like, you can't have an account of these people that doesn't explain why someone wanted to kill them.
It's because they were so nice. We can't have someone saying God loves you. Get rid of them. Yes, 100%. That's what I was kind of stumbling around about. Yeah, Jesus gets the exact same treatment. Absolutely. So yeah, in the same way, there's obviously distinctions between Martin Luther King and Jesus, but in the same way that attending to a thick account of what King was actually up to in his time and place that would lead to him being surveilled and killed problematizes the narrative that he is some sort of paragon of being nice in all times and all places. So does, obviously, it seems to me, a thick reading of Jesus in the Gospels troubles a reading of Jesus as just a real nice guy who got the wrong end of. He was just misunderstood, and tragically, he was killed for just being too nice to too many people, by these meanies. It's hard to maintain that reading in light of the Jesus you actually encounter in the Gospels, at least on my reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all right. So this isn't just Martin Luther King week. It's also kind of the official kickoff to the presidential campaign with the Iowa caucus. And so help me think through.
Oh no.
So on the one hand, with King, you're critiquing a sort of understanding of civility that is in service to something else. And yet we also live in this time where it seems as though social media and the internet incentivize just a tearing down of civil discourse in the name of clicks and fundraising. So I guess so. That's the backdrop that I'm kind of thinking of right now. And then just a lot of the discourse following the October 7th Hamas massacre. In it, like so in a lot of arenas, it seems to be there's anything goes. The gloves are off. But that isn't necessarily the kind of thing that you're recommending either. So give us the broad brushstrokes of your book and what prompted you to write it.
Sure. Yeah. It seems to me that it's true that the political discourse, if you could call it that, in our country, and discourse generally speaking in our country, is not great. It's not doing great. And that comes along with certainly online, which everything's kind of online now. Online's in the real life. It's all kind of broken containment. People being very vicious to each other. So what prompted me to think about this topic was the sense that sometimes I agree with that assessment. Basically, I agree that someone or some person is speaking in such a way that is bad, to put it as just simply as I can. But also sometimes I hear folks invoke the language of civility or polarization or something in ways that seem in bad faith, consciously or subconsciously. I don't know. That it's invoked in a way of saying, why can't we all get along? Why are these people over here so upset? Why is your voice raising? You see this all the time when someone starts to talk about an issue that's poignant or heated or something. Like, there is a move that someone can make on the other side that you're debating that will say, oh, you need to calm down. I don't think your tone of voice is really helping things right now. And that is, I hate that, really. But more to the point, sometimes that seemed to be evoked very intentionally to blunt the sort of force of what a person was actually saying as they were bringing forth a kind of like prophetic critique of a thing, or like, hey, indiscriminate bombing of civilians is bad. And it's like, hey, you need to calm down. Like, there's a sense of like, why is the number one concern right now the tone of my voice and not like this particular action or policy that we're talking about? So in some times, in some cases, it's like, that's for sure. I wouldn't use language of civility, but not reading people in bad faith, not just like attacking people immediately in their character personal. You know what I mean? That seems bad. And then sometimes it seems, sometimes that seems called for and good, and sometimes that seems bad. And so assessing when that call is good and bad, it seems to me, was like what I wanted to do is for myself, really. It's like, I don't want it to be just special pleading that, I like it when it's people I like, and I don't like it when it's people I don't like. But rather, what are criteria by which Christians could assess when those calls should be heeded, and might even be like used to subvert an unjust status quo, actually, and what are times in which they should be ignored, frankly, and they are being used to blunt the force of prophetic critique and criticism, seems to me. So that was kind of the background. So yeah, yep. So I mean, it's a little bit broader than the presidential election coming up, but another way of saying it would be like, what's the difference between I don't know, a presidential candidate like trading in like overtly racist rhetoric to try to win votes versus somebody protesting that same presidential candidate for using that rhetoric. There could be a tendency to be like, well, they're both wrong because they're both using mean language, but it's like, or whatever. But it's like, I'm not so sure that's the force of the problem there. It almost feels like a distraction or something like that to me. So that's kind of how I started down the rabbit hole of this book, as it is.
So talk about, so the subtitle of your book is Christ and Prophetic Division. And one of the other quotes you attach alongside the Martin Luther King one that I read is Jesus from Luke chapter 12, a passage that no preacher really likes when it comes up in the lectionary. Jesus, promising to bring division. So this is something I've thought about recently. The theologian Robert Jensen makes the point that, when the word of the Lord comes to the prophets in the Old Testament, it doesn't come as like a string of words, or sentences. It's Jesus who comes to the prophets. And Jesus does not tell them what to say, but rather the effect of Jesus encountering them is what the prophets say. And so like reading your book, it made me think like, oh, well, the result of Amos's encounter with Jesus is this angry, fiery sermon. So yeah. So talk about Jesus and how we might have a better understanding of righteous anger and prophetic division.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, Jesus should be he should be the criteria that I would judge what I ought to do and how I ought to move and speak. I'm going to not be perfect at that. I mean, obviously, but that's the bar at which I'm trying to like live or follow. That's the person I'm trying to follow. And so, it just struck me as odd that people would hold up. Now, it's anachronistic because language of civility isn't really going to be used in the first century or Second Temple Judaism or anything like that. But insofar as it gets analogized to that time and place, Jesus does not seems right in line with a prophetic tradition of folks, as you say, that have a word from the Lord, and it is not always a nice, happy word, and they are not always either an actual word, speaking with civility, as we might say, including to people directly in certain cases, nor is the content of it always just kind of like, I would say most of the time is not respecting just like the way things are, and you shouldn't like cause trouble in this way. Jesus in his like body is disruptive of the status quo, I would say, both the political, like socio-political kind of cultural norms that are associated with like, especially like Roman kind of hierarchies and such, gender hierarchies, things like that. But also just like a kind of, you could call it almost like a metaphysical status quo or something. Like the whole kind of game is like to turn the world upside down from what people think ought to be and should be the case. So it just seemed to me kind of evident, like as an instinct before I dug in this way, that Jesus doesn't fit this kind of Jesus is getting the treatment Jesus often gets, which is like Jesus gets baptized into, because the gospel is always getting incarnated in the like places it's going. There's always this like complex interrelationship between word and culture, but like there's always that tendency to turn Jesus into like a good Anglo-Saxon warrior or whatever. And this felt like one of our ways of doing that in our time, at least in certain social circles, is Jesus as a good, perfect gentleman, a good respecter of civility, Jesus who would never say a mean word, Jesus who would, and it just, that just doesn't fly to me, at least if you're actually interested in, like, don't let the Bible get in the way of your, theology or anything, but Jesus doesn't seem to fit with that. It seems to me that's not always that's not how do I say this? That can be like problematic. That could like rub me the wrong way sometimes, as Jesus can do. I know it's blessed are they who are not offended by him, but sometimes I'm like, oh no, like he'll speak in a way that seems, I'm not like loving it or whatever, but that doesn't change the fact that's what he's doing. Like that doesn't change the fact that he's not just always perfectly measured in his speech, it seems to me, or like driven by his bowels, by compassion to do X, Y, Z, so it just seems to me Jesus was in line with a lot of folks in the prophetic tradition that Jesus, I think, sees himself self-consciously as a part of, especially Isaiah, that's not the primary goal. Now, it's not good to be vicious on purpose or something. There's like a goal there's a reason why you would use this speech, but he's in line with a long line of folks who speak and act in this way. I mean, I don't know. It's not really breaking news or anything, except for folks who want Jesus to reinforce ethic today that would say to be a Christian means to never speak in a way that would be considered or judged to be uncivil by other folks.
Yeah. I mean, let the dead bury their dead is about the most the rudest thing you could say to like a grieving person, right?
I know. It's not like pastoral exactly.
Like, why did the tower of Siloam fall? Blah blah blah, and Jesus's response is like, "Oh, like it's going to be even worse for you." Like,
yeah.
There's always something.
Sorry, go ahead.
There's often something more urgent at stake.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Or like Luke 4. I mean, the reason they almost kill him right off the gate, and it's not because he's not causing trouble on that instant. Yeah, it's just kind of all throughout. There's really obvious times where it's like, I mean, if you're a fig tree and Jesus is mad, you better watch out for sure. But also, brood of vipers, etc. Like there's times where he can really go for it in these certain speeches that are collected mostly in Matthew and Luke. But then there's other subtle times too that I think you're pointing to that he kind of, once you look for it, it's like it's all over the place, really.
So, and I was thinking about our previous conversation on your other book. This idea of civility in the public square in Christian discourse, and the lost cause mythology, they seem to be similar in the use of manners to a particular end. And so, if you could summarize for folks what you do at the beginning of the book in terms of talking about the derivation of civility and where this comes from, because it's different from virtue.
That's yes, I would say yes. Civility is one of those concepts, like a lot of moral concepts, or concepts, I guess in this case, that can be treated as though it's like constant through time. The meaning of it is constant through time. It does not have a history. It does not have a genealogy. There's not different uses of it. And so I try to start out, I mean, I'm not a historian, but I always like to frame myself like where are we coming from as we are talking about this issue. I mean, kind of in a Mackinterian Foucauldian mode. In this case, a little bit more Foucauldian. Anyway, so yeah, civility was in the modern instances of it was like there's at least three different predominant kind of conceptualizations of civility that were being self-consciously put forward by certain Enlightenment modern philosophers to replace the sense of concordia that was meant to bind Christendom together in post Protestant Reformation and then the sort of birth of liberal nation state. There's a sense of like, well, that's not going to hold us together anymore. Quite obviously, English Civil War, et cetera, was helpful, and there's a lot of like turmoil that was going on. So, what would bind folks together was on the minds of a lot of English white political philosophers, and so civility, or this language of civility, kind of slotted in as an option. But this is Teresa Bejan talks about. She traces these three different kind of theories of civility that were predominant, that were not the same. They were contesting what even it would look like to live into this in their time and place. There's John Locke's sense of like civility as love or civil charity, such that the way you speak to another person represents and kind of embodies the love you're supposed to have for a fellow like a citizen. Hobbes associates civility with like silence on matters that would be contentious, that would lead folks eventually to. He was living in and around the English Civil War, and he saw quite well what these Puritans and Quakers and all these other folks could do if you let that speech go too far. That's kind of the concern. So best just not to talk about this kind of thing. Quite ironic given his very iconoclastic sensibilities in other contexts, but he also is interested in be complacent to the sovereign. You know what I mean? When he's got his political philosophy in his theology guiding him there. And then she points very weirdly, but I like it a lot, to Roger. No, it's not typical a person who's brought out in these conversations. Roger Williams, who he was a Baptist for maybe a week, but he is a dissident. He never found a home. But he talked about what she calls what he and she calls mere civility, which was like the willingness to continue to fight with another person and basically kind of not kill them. But that could be that could encompass using all sorts of language that might be mean or like passioned or something to that effect. And so one of the problems with civility talk, it seems to me, as it's typically conducted in like casual conversation, is it just kind of assumes a constancy of definition that actually isn't there when it comes to civility, certainly historically as being crafted. And the second is the desire to seek some sort of like habit or something that would bind folks together in these newly created, nation states that need something to bind folks together, it seems, to people. So that's kind of the project on the board. The problem with it, generally speaking, it seems to me, is that it assumes like a picture of what civility like looks like, sounds like, who's included in and out of those conversations. And some folks are just not able to be like, they're never going to fit the picture of what John Locke thought of as a good participant in a civil conversation by virtue of who they are in society. It bakes in a kind of vision of who are subjects, in the coming world, and excludes others in that process. But it's put very value neutrally, and so there's a sense in which you could kind of lose sight of the kind of valuations that are being made as civility is being crafted in this kind of a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it made me think. So that the way this comes out in Protestant theology is Luther's two kingdoms theory. That Luther, like some of these Enlightenment philosophers, Luther was horrified by the violence of the peasant revolt, and so he wants to split, how Christians understand their loyalty to the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of the earth. And so it's you can critique it, with hindsight, but it's a reasonable concern about how to hold a polis together without violence.
Right.
And then
Hmm.
earlier this year, I reread a bunch of Jonathan Edwards, and my conclusion from that was that he is poorly treated by high school English and history classes.
Yes.
I was like, there's a lot more here than and so one of Edwards's concerns about democracy in America's founding was if you don't have a common fear of a sovereign God, an awe of a sovereign God, there's not enough to hold people together and keep them from killing each other. And so,
Wow.
yeah, so it just, I wonder, does the appeal today to something called civility, does it assume there is a common denominator to us that in fact isn't there?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think so. I think part of why I think that's right. I think partly it's like the assumption is that we're all in a single moral community or civic community or something, and then given that, we should all be speaking in this kind of a way. And that's an assumption that is not true. It seems to me we're not all in the same communities. We're not all having the same experiences in this country, let's say. And it kind of is almost trying to like speak into being something that I don't think actually is the case. In fact, the folks that I'm thinking of that would like push back against it from like, let's say like King's side, when we're talking to start out, what's happening in part is like a bringing to bear a recognition that this is actually not the case. We actually are not like all in the same moral community going somewhere else. And so it's almost like it's a desire to replace. Yeah, I think you're right. Like replace that kind of sense of a unifying like thing that would like unite everybody in fear of or in awe of. That's gone. And then this will replace it. But it's very, it doesn't seem to me it's going to be up to the task of doing that. It's replacing it with like a set of manners rather than anything more deep than that.
It is, and it's
yeah.
interesting to me. It's interesting to me too that the genesis of civility are these concerns about civil unrest and violence, and at the same time, at least in American history, right, the war has been the means by which you unite the people together.
Yeah. Oh my God, it gives our lives meaning, as I've been told. Absolutely. Yeah. And the conflation. You can be quite civil and be very violent, and you can be quite uncivil by definitions and nonviolent or pacifist. I don't know if nonviolent. So, yeah, that gets conflated, I think, in our mind. But I think, yeah, that doesn't seem to bear out that connection between being civil and being not violent. It seems to me, both in our policy, or both in the policy of the United States, and also in even personal interactions with folks. As long as I speak nicely, I can do all sorts of stuff. But heaven forbid I.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Jeffrey Pugh at the beginning.
Love him.
And like a good example of what Stanley Herawas, right, has dedicated his career to Christian nonviolence, and yet I don't know that anyone would ever characterize him as a civil person.
I don't think so. It would be interesting if I'd like to hear what they were talking about if they did. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
And he's you could perceive him as being uncivil because he cares too much about the truth that is Jesus.
Yeah, I think often. Yeah, I think that's right. There's a sense of. Now, I talk about later in the book, and that's not to say there's not like dangers to this kind of speech. Like inherent, like, what's her name? At least Tessman talks about like these, like there's a sense of like to use the kind of speech in service of a wider truth. You care so much about the truth that you're willing to, speak with a loud voice, draw with big images to get people to see. There's a kind of cost to that and a danger to that, and the danger could be you lose sight of the goal toward which that's to be aimed, and then you're just using speech for its own sake, right? There's always a kind of, it's like the Jonah temptation or something. Just because you're using prophetic, I mean, maybe it's not a great example, but you get the idea, right? So there's dangers associated with that, but the folks who tend to do it, I think, are or get that kind of label, I think, would be folks who are just very interested in speaking truthfully, clearly, mostly, first of all, as a first kind of principle. So yeah, I think a lot of folks come to mind, but certainly Hauerwas is in that camp for sure.
And related to his work, reading your book made me wonder if part of the problem is Christians in America locating their primary identity in a particular part of American civil life rather than the church.
Yeah, I could see that. It would depend on where we were, like in the country, in the United States. But I can see in certain circles, there's a sense of like your primary kind of goal is to be a good citizen, but not in the sense of like I'm working for the good of this, like the civic life, the civitas that I'm in, ultimately and actually. This kind of like a moral chemotherapy or something that Dr. King talks about, but whereas like I'm actually working for the good ultimately of this society, whether people realize that or not. But yeah, in certain circles, I think it's like that would include just, you need to, frankly, it's like certain places of power. I mean, I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is the capital of North Carolina. And it's not like DC or anything, but it's, it's the capital, and there's a sort of like decorum. You're supposed to kind of like, you're supposed to act and speak in a certain kind of way with the understanding that we're going to go to Clyde Cooper's and have barbecue after this, or we're going to go to the local haunt, players retreat and have a beer and all, the sort of Tip O'Neill and Reagan kind of fantasy. In those circles, I think that's the sort of thing you're supposed to do. And you're not supposed to like come in hot and just suddenly being like yelling about the pot. Like, what are we talking about? like, you're supposed to kind of, you like Duke, I like UNC, but at the end of the day, which I would disagree with that actually, but anyway. So there is that, but in other circles, I think there are other sort of norm, like other kind of church, other sort of church practices, other sort of places where that norm, I don't know if would be as held up. So I think that kind of depends on where we are in the country, but I think you're right. There's some circle, the way I would want to say the book is there's some places and there's some churches, there's some iterations of church that I could quite understand why somebody would want to say they need to be more civil. And what they mean, i.e. they're toxic, they're spewing like overtly racist, sexist, homophobic like views like all day long and twice on Sunday. But the language, and so there would be a tendency to say, oh, those churches are uncivil. But how I would want to say it is, you're racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic, you're unfaithful to the gospel. The problem isn't like the tone of voice. It's not like the problem with Westboro Baptist Church is they protest. The problem is the views that are being put forth by that in that manner. That's the problem, it seems to me.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay. So to take it away from like Westboro Baptist and Mark
please.
Driscoll type embodiments, but so in chapter 4, the end of civility, you point back to churches that did not support or participate in the civil rights movement out of a sense of civility, decorum, Southern genteel norms. So talk about kind of that history.
Of churches that were
Yeah.
Well, I think in North Carolina, there's this book details that kind of I'm following there in Greensboro, North Carolina, the sort of which Jesse Jackson was involved. He was a UNCG or A&T student, excuse me. And there's a there was the sit-in movement that was going there. It kind of started in Greensboro, and there were folks who were against the sit-in movement. You know, there were like Clanners and stuff, Citizens Council people, and then there are people who were for it. Obviously, the Black Church and other folks besides. And then there were folks that were like, "This is you're this is just not nice. You know, you shouldn't be doing this." We like to think of ourselves as North Carolina, you know, as that goes, like a purple state. We're both red and blue, and you know, we have a sort of good relations here, and so there's a sense of like wanting to maintain this image of like a progressive Southern state or a modern Southern state, or like doing things quote slowly or in the right way, or you know. And so there were churches that would push back against it, just exactly how King writes against it in the letter of Birmingham Jail. I don't disagree with the ends you're aiming at, but I disagree with how you're getting there. You know, it's being too disruptive, is causing more trouble, it's going too fast. And so churches in that vein, it seemed to me, white churches obviously are they're so committed to this norm of this kind of illusion of civility and concordia and all this kind of stuff, that they are just not willing to. It's not even like be against. It's kind of just like kind of neutral. They try to be neutral on something like that popping off in 1960, which is obviously an illusion. You can't be neutral. If you don't want to do something, then you're just on the side of what's already going on currently. And so there's just this tendency of just like holding up that as the chief goal or good or something, as a sign of your love, a sign of your like kind of maturity as a Christian. That ended up keeping folks from doing what they needed to be doing. That seems to me.
And I remember Will Williman, friend of the podcast, talking about how when he became bishop in Alabama, he had that letter like on his wall, because a lot of those pastors would have been under his care. And I think in terms of my the way it manifests for me is the expectation, spoken or unspoken, depending on the parishioner, that we keep politics out of church, right. out of the pulpit, and I mean that's an appeal to civility in the name of not encroaching upon my political values.
Right. Which is, I'm sure you much well know better than I do. Although I'm married to a minister, and
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm loving it. You only get that kind of accusation when it's politics somebody doesn't agree with or like. It's obviously an impossibility to separate theology and politics. I mean, you well know this. But what always strikes me is it's always you could preach all day long in a way that embeds or assumes or even front loads the political economic views you might have. But if it's when something disagrees with it, that's when it will be like, you need to don't get political. And it's just kind of a way of misspeaking almost. The way it should be said is, I don't like the political implication you're drawing from the gospel or whatever. But it gets talked about, don't bring politics into the pulpit. That's extra bad in the Baptist tradition, with a deep and it seems to me venerable commitment to the separation of church and state. At least traditionally, not every contemporary Southern Baptist knows this. But that's not the same thing as a separation of theology and politics. So, it seemed to me this invocation of like not getting political, a depoliticized gospel was a kind of rhetorical move that could be used in service to upholding, white supremacist status quo in the 1950s and 60s, for instance, embedded in Jim Crow law, that you could not think of it as political. You could just call it, that's just the way it is. That's what it is. It's political to protest it. It's not political to uphold it. And so it's the same kind of, it's kind of like, it's almost like the the one breaking civility norms. It's like who gets the sort of who has the trump card, who has the thing that you are, who is violating the thing, who is the one that's got like the status quo, and who is the one that's violating this norm, and who's making that distinction. That's why folks like Amy Césaire or King or John Lewis, what they're doing is trying to like invert that. James Cone and a lot of his theology, they're trying to like invert that assessment and be like, what you are naming as the bad is actually the good. What you are naming as the barbaric is actually the vanguard of true civility, if you want to use that language. And what you are calling civility or the civilizational mission of the church is actually the destroyer of worlds. It's like it's making people try to invert their vision on what they're.
That's, I mean, this is on page 95 of your book, and this is from Thomas Aquinas, who I don't think anyone would have confused with a social justice warrior. Thomas Aquinas famously echoes this sentiment, arguing that one can commit the sin of anger by becoming wrathful, of course, but also by being deficient in anger. He who is not angry, whereas he has cause to be, sins. For unreasonable patience is the hotbed of many vices. It fosters negligence and incites not only the wicked, but even the good to do wrong. And you were like, because even people who, in my experience, and this is, I'm talking about white Christians who do want to hear politics in the church, what they want, they want their politics to be affirmed in church. People, neither group of people want to have their worldview and their assumptions and their status quo be the water that crashes against the rock that is Christ. The person who says, the person who is okay with like political preaching isn't okay with the result of that being like, oh, wait, I'm a victimizer in a way. I didn't, they want to be the hero of the story. And so it's that idea of civility is still operative underneath that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's Brian Massengale draws attention to that that strand of Aquinas very wonderfully. And it's the same kind of dynamic in his context, Catholic churches, Catholic Church. I think that's right. I think there's a sense of like, willingness to be convicted. I mean, willingness to like if the goal is like truth, if the goal is trying to get at truth, get at God, get at Jesus, being willing to like call it political or not political, like to be forced to face yourself, as Augustine might put it, like forced to face yourself in terms of where you are in the world today, in the relationship to your neighbors, and relationship to the city that you're in. That there's a real way that people, I think you're right to draw to, like, certainly in my like white Christians really resist that in a variety of ways. That's why I do quite like, I can't work in every context, or maybe it can, and it hasn't been tried, but I quite like sermon talkback. I quite like dialogical preaching. I'm Anabaptist enough to like those practices, because it destabilizes the idea that when the word is coming, it's not coming from a singular voice, but it's kind of being brought to bear by the entire body. That's kind of having to be discerned as we go, as we work together to get at truth. It's like it makes it harder for me to be troubled by that, because I'm already primed to recognize, like, I'm going to be hearing other people's voices as we talk about and discern our way to the truth. My first work is on communal discernment in context of churches, and I'm still quite enthralled with that idea, hard and problematic as it may be in certain cases. So I think you're right. Folks just don't go to church oftentimes to be troubled. That's not how it goes. And that's okay in some ways. I mean, the world stinks and the world is hard and people need comfort. That's for real. I mean, but also if that's all we're ever getting, that's probably not great because.
Well, yeah, I mean, because
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want. So it's inappropriate for. So whenever I hear colleagues of mine say that, like, they've decided to be prophetic this coming Sunday, I'm like, oh, like your poor congregation, like. So it can't be just law without gospel.
Mm-hmm.
But it can't be gospel without law, because that's an abstraction that Bonhoeffer called cheap grace.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it, you appeal to Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 here in the book too. And like appeals to understandings of love as the highest good or virtue, without realizing that when Paul speaks of love never ending there, he's referring to Jesus. And so you can't have you can't have a conception of love that is independent of the character of Jesus revealed in the Gospels, where he is frequently angry.
Right, exactly. It takes you. If you're talking about what Paul says, you can't just read 1 Corinthians 13 like you're at a wedding and like just. I mean, that's a perfectly good passage to read at a wedding, but you know what I mean. Like just dropped out of context in a chapter. Like, yeah, absolutely. Paul is constantly referring you back to the wounded, crucified and resurrected Jesus, and that takes you right back to where we started, right? So yeah, that's 100% correct. Nothing worries me more and certainly annoys me more when it's the first thing you're saying, when it's not just the preacher who's like, I'm going to get prophetic this week, but it's like someone else getting on social media like, if you don't talk about blah 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 this week, then you are not being it's kind of like, well, usually it's my friends who are not pastors or priests either. It's usually who have no idea of the complexities and what's going on in that congregation, how many long conversations have been having. So it's the sense of like that goal, like what is being aimed at, what is being directed at by this person or this congregation or these people, that is the real work, not just this one kind of heroic moment of prophetic witness where I get up and say a thing really angrily and everyone just stands and applauds. Like that's kind of what folks sometimes have in their mind, I think. And that's, I think we especially like white dudes should be quite wary of reinforcing that kind of, Christian heroism or something like that in the name of the prophetic.
Well, yeah. And I mean, you talked about like communal discernment, to realize, so patience is also one of the virtues, right? And and to, that we exist in a culture of hot takes, and like that whole, like, if your preacher isn't preaching on X this Sunday, I mean, like, really, it's like what, 5 days from now? Like, how do you know 5 days from now, like, this is going to be the right thing to have said? Like, there's like, it's activism apart from discernment and wisdom.
Yeah. Well, and like, if it's like constantly, it tends to be the same folks who say that too, or it's like, they're always saying that. So it's like, so what are you saying? Like, that just every week what you tell me to do, I do, I guess is what you're saying. The trick of it, I mean, that sometimes is true. I mean, sometimes is true. Like, the Sunday after September 11th, 2001, I went to church on Sunday. The church was packed up and the preacher just barreled on ahead with their sermon like it was any other Sunday, as if weird. The church was packed like for just no reason. That's wild. Do you know what I mean? Like that's one of those where, but it's when that card's getting played, it just tends to be played in a way of like, I think it's got this allure of that heroism that like, that's what I think is, you need to get up and do this thing. And, like,
and again, it's all about power and agency, right? Because the people who exhort civility are the people who perceive themselves as being in charge.
Yeah.
And the people who exhort Christians to say X, Y, or Z are doing so out of a heroism that reveals a kind of a self-image of power and privilege.
At least they can, but you're right. Exactly. I think that's right. And exactly right. You think of yourself as a person who is able to make that kind of a risk without much consequence, perhaps, to you or your people. There's a kind of like, it's easy to say from halfway across the country or something, that you and that, there's that kind of an issue. So I do think that this like love, especially love, like cruciform love, is a helpful guide that gives, it doesn't like answer every acute question, of like, how do I specifically preach on this passage from the lectionary this week? But it like gives a guide of like, I can't be balking if it is the time to do that, because I can't be, that would cause trouble. Like that can't be the reason. There needs to be other, Jesus reasons why you should not be doing that this week. Or it'd be like, the context for this is not a sermon. The context for this is going to be this ongoing a Bible study we're doing at the church. You know what I mean? Like, or whatever. That would be but it would be a guiding reason. That seems like a pretty good one for Christians to have, love embodied in Jesus, rather than just, I want to be prophetic for prophetic's sake, or however I conceptualize what comes to mind when I say that, or I need to not cause any trouble because it's never okay to disrupt the causing dissension, in the, quote Paul in one of those places. That's never okay, right? There's a sense of like, it cuts through that kind of like limitedly true. It's like true in what it's focusing on, but it's not true. And it's like screening out other, passages, practices, and strands of scripture that say that need to be balanced with that kind of invocation. Yeah,
that's and that that connects back to like the Luke 12 passage that you dedicate at the. It's so I'm thinking of like Bonhoeffer's treatment of the call of the disciples in discipleship, where Bonhoeffer's saying that there is no particular content to discipleship. There's no program, there's no curriculum, because it's just following after him. And I feel like if Christians did a better job of just trying to stick with Jesus, then they would be disruptive when it's appropriate to be disruptive.
They certainly wouldn't automatically say somebody is like off because they're being disruptive. That would be that for sure. Like, oh, somebody stood up and interrupted somebody speaking at the National Prayer Breakfast or something. Well, that's wrong because it's disruptive. Like that would not be probably on the cards, right? Whatever you're personally, that's right. So it would be a sense of what we're trying to do is follow after Jesus, and come what may, as the case may be.
I remember I preached on the parable of the unjust steward, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and it was just kind of re-narrating it, and I started getting heckled by someone in the pew who didn't realize like this was like scripture, and I was like, and it was like, oh my gosh, like you could see in real time, like this is why they killed him. Like it just never happened to me before, and then I'm like, why has this never happened to me before?
I don't know about that, but yeah, that's awesome. One time I sang a song. I wrote a song based on the Magnificat. It was just basically the words of Magnificat. Nothing special, but it was just something for the church that we were at, and so I sang it around probably in Advent. And it's pretty straightforward. I mean, including the parts of cast down the, casting down the thrones and the rich go away empty, and and someone came up after that service and said, God doesn't hate the rich. And I was like, what? I just didn't even quite know what she was talking about. But she's like, that song that you wrote, God doesn't hate the rich. And I said, that's like just straight from Luke. So that's an interesting conversation, but it's probably a conversation to have like with, Luke / Jesus / Mary, like it's it's kind of telling that, it's telling. It's like, but there's a great gift to that where I can say, I didn't just make this up. I'm not the one who used this language. This is Mary echoing Miriam, So it's like, there's a sense of like letting the words that are already present, these like these witnesses that are already present in these texts that we call God-breathed and useful for teaching and preaching and correcting, to trouble those waters like kind of for us,
Mhm.
in myself too. It's not like I think I said this too. It's like, it's not like I am untroubled by that language either, but I'm unwilling to say it's not there, because it makes me feel more comfortable that it would not be there. You know, I'd
Mhm.
rather feel uncomfortable and have to wrestle around what this means and the implications of this than dismiss it because, well, I don't like that. That doesn't fit with my vision of what the Bible or scripture or preaching is supposed to be about, or Christian music or something. Um,
I wonder, and again, like this gets, to the lost cause. I think, at the end of the day, is it all about money and wealth? Because if it's not just Mary, right? It's like you can read the Cappadocian fathers and the beginning of the church. Like they had very concrete understandings of
Oh my God.
of riches and rich people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, like, we've distanced ourselves from the original teaching of the church. And I wonder if things like civility and decorum are built up around the tradition, as a way of maintaining our preferred understandings of capital.
I agree. I think that sounds a lot right to me. It certainly makes exchange go smoother when people are not disagreeing, fighting with one another. When you're saying something like, if you've got more than one pair of shoes, you're stealing from the poor.
I mean, like
You know?
like like this is that's what got King killed, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's not like it wasn't his dream.
No, it's the three: militarism, poverty, and white supremacy. Criticizing the Vietnam War, marching with sanitation workers. That's what he was doing when he was in Memphis. It's like, yeah, there's a sense of, and he quite knew this too. Like, if you want to make change, you probably want to hit people. If that's the thing that people care about, well, hit them in their wallet. That's going to bring change much more quickly than like talking very nicely and asking with a nice tone of voice. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great. I mean, obviously, like, I don't know, these church fathers. I mean, they're constantly talking in this way. I mean, saying things about money, you're like charging it interest that would kind of put our entire economic system under judgment. It's like almost incommensurable, like the language they're using to critique, like how they're critiquing what it means to be a person of faith living in these contexts. So I think that's right. I think civility what I really think civility does is it gives people a way to not talk about a thing. People do not want to talk about capitalism, et cetera, and the ways it's shaping, especially like neoliberal capitalism or advanced late stage, the way that shapes my imagination and how I see the world deeply, like whiteness too. People don't want to talk about that. So it's easier to say you're being mean, you're being uncivil, than it is to talk about. You can kind of talk around a thing without talking about a thing. Someone stands up to interrupt Joe Biden, about what's going on in Gaza. It's easier to say they shouldn't do that. They shouldn't. They per se, in principle, should not be doing that, rather than talk about the thing itself. And the conversation can be all about tone of voice, appropriateness. This is not the time. You're too angry. Blah blah blah. Rather than it gets away from. Yeah, exactly.
Which is interesting because so like Luther would call that a theology of glory, right? That like you're avoiding just calling a thing a thing.
I love that.
Which is what grace and the cross free you to do, is just freely name the reality before you. Yeah, that's. I also wonder, reading your book, I was wondering, like, I feel like, and maybe this is a characterization, white people don't know how to process other people's feelings in public. And so, like, like when someone's like righteously angry and stands up to Joe Biden about Gaza, like we just don't know what to do with people's feelings.
I think there's a lot to that. Yeah, I certainly know that if people of color are especially angry in public, it's very threatening to white folks. And but I think speaking from my own experience with this, I think sometimes we're good at happiness, although not always, honestly. Sadness, maybe, you know, a little bit. It's like that anger piece, as like Audre Lorde talks about. I quote her in the book, like anger as it should be thought of as like a signal, not too dissimilar from the Aquinas quote you invoked earlier, like a signal of a thing. It's a very helpful signal of something's off. Now that can break one way or the other. It could be, you could be wrong in why you think something's off. You know, it's not a perfect signal, but you have to be allowed to feel the signal and like see it as like a potentially as fruitful and helpful and ambivalent of a motivator as happiness, to motivate you to see what's going on. And I think in certain circles, you're not allowed to feel certain things in public in that same kind of way.
Well, I wonder how many families have come to your wife for a funeral saying that, like, we don't want this to be sad. We don't want this to be a funeral. We want this to be a celebration of life. So it's, you know, it's a preemptive avoidance of feelings.
Yeah. So, yeah, you can be sad to a point, but not too sad. You can be sad, but not for too long. You shouldn't be too crying about it, you know,
or angry at God. We don't want that voiced. We'll give, it's okay if the pastor gives permission to it, but we're not going to actually engage in it.
Well, in all cases, what you most want to be, or are supposed to be, quote unquote, is in control. And so if you're not in control, if you're not the decider and the controller, you're not fit to control and rule, if you're not in proper control at all times in all places. So there's almost it's deeper than just being embarrassed of it all. I think that's part of it. It's almost like you're violating some vision of what you're supposed to be. Like, you know, like you're not supposed to act and look in this kind of way. Weeping in public, crying in public, angry in public. Yeah. Sorry.
Like that's helpful so it's an avoidance of living contingently, which is exactly how Jesus lived.
Yes. Yes. So interesting. Pannenberg. Yeah. You're a creature, you know. Yeah. You're not God. It seems like a pretty good thing to start with. But you know, a lot of white theology, I think, is crafted around trying to say that's not the case. That actually we see the world from God's point of view, and we are not, you know, we're in control. We see all, and we are not seen. So yes, I think you're 100% right that reticence to some of those passions is deeper and drawing upon something deeper that relates to this conversation. Yeah.
Well, Ryan, the book again is The End of Civility: Christ and Prophetic Division. Where can people find out more about you?
I don't know. Google, Facebook, I guess. I don't know. I'm around.
I'm around.
Yeah. Come down to Bowie's Creek and we can hang out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for giving me your time.
No, thank you for giving me your time. It was a great joy.
I will